session 3, so we're going to do question, persuade, and refer, or QPR. And this is a suicide prevention trainer. Our presenter today is Caroline Ludy. She's from the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI Minnesota. For Caroline, in her role as an educator with NAMI Minnesota, she provides mental health education, training, and resources for families and the general community. She's been with NAMI for the past 2 years, but has 8 years of health research experience. She'll talk you a little bit more about herself as well. She also helps to coordinate the Multicultural Young Adult Advisory Board here in Minnesota and is driven to continue outreach on mental health issues to all communities, particularly those underserved, which fits also why she's here to do QPR with us. So please give Caroline a warm round of applause and welcome.
Thank you, Nicole. So as Nicole mentioned, I am from NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Just before I begin, can everybody hear me? Because my voice doesn't always tend to project. So I always want to make sure that I'm crystal clear, because this is a really important subject matter. And as well too, I just want to make sure that my communication skills are the way good. But as Nicole said, so I've actually been with NAMI for just over 2 years, but prior to that, I was actually in community health research for about 8.5 years, mostly on, I did work in a couple of studies, but mostly work with pediatric studies, so, as well as to AIDS research. So my foray into mental health is relatively recent over the last 2 years, but I've had personal experience with mental health challenges myself. I do live with depression, but as well as my family. So I really think that it's important for me to address that, because I think in terms of just the social stigma surrounding suicide and mental illness are still quite prevalent, but I'm glad that we're having this discussion, and I'm so happy that that interventions such as QPR are being actually deployed throughout, not across the state, but across the world as well too. And just a little bit about NAMI. We're actually a grassroots organization, and we've been around for about 40 years. But really our 3 primary things is that we do a lot of legislative advocacy as well as education. But primarily too, we have a lot of different support groups, not specifically surrounding suicide in terms of suicide loss or bereavement. Those are separate support groups outside of NAMI. But if you do go to our website, NAMIMN.org, you will find a number of our support groups available there as well. And just before I begin, there's a couple of just housekeeping items. So everybody did get 3 handouts. So the first one, if you want to follow along the presentation, is just for PowerPoint. The second one, which I will discuss during the presentation, is a list of resources. There's a front and a back. And then as well, the third one is just an evaluation, but of course that's all at the end of the presentation. And lastly too, if there's anybody here who is an educator, so in the state of Minnesota over the last 1.5 years now, it's been mandated that all teachers receive at least 1 hour of suicide prevention training, and this does qualify for that 1 hour of licensure. So if anybody does require this, at the very front here, I do have a CEU, continuing education credit as well, that you can submit to your board in order to get that licensure requirement. And just finally too, I always say, if you have any questions, please feel free, of course, to ask them, because I'm one of those individuals, if I don't ask a question right away, I kind of forget it. And so as well too, I want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable. If at all you feel distressed, I would say during today's presentation, or you have any questions that I can't answer, I'd be more than welcome to direct you to the person at NAMI that can, or of course, additional outside resources as well too. So what is QPR? So QPR is question, persuade, refer.
They don't talk to me as a therapist as well.
Oh yeah, yes, sorry, thank you. Usually you don't have a therapist in the audience.
I'm here
and so
a therapist. Also, we have Sarah Lentz, who will be here in about a half hour, so you know, talk to us.
I appreciate that, yes. Thank you. So QPR, question, persuade, refer, it's really a couple of things. QPR is an idea and an action step, but really it's not intended to be a form of counseling. And you see here, there is a therapist in the room, but if you're not, or you weren't able to treat or diagnose before you came, you won't be able to treat and diagnose afterward. This is really a foundational course in suicide prevention, but it is intended to offer hope really through 3 positive action steps, QPR, which again I'll discuss a little bit later on as well too. So when I talk about suicide as well too, I have had intimate experience with the conversation of suicide with my own family members as well as a couple of friends. Before I was actually trained in QPR and before I dived into mental health research, I had no idea what QPR was or even knew that it existed. It's been around for about 20 years. It is an evidence-based research practice, but I actually employed the techniques of QPR without realizing it. So it's really that we want to train anybody in the community, which we call gatekeepers. So that's anybody. You know, it's friends, it's family, it's teachers, it's faith leaders, anybody that can learn to help recognize somebody in the suicidal ideation by either thinking about suicide or they're planning it. And even if they're not struggling, understanding how to connect that person to resources and where they can get help. But before we talk about that, there's really a lot of, unfortunately, taboos surrounding suicide. It's really complex. We know that, for a number of individuals, suicide is actually the result, not of one thing. It's not a result of one situational thing or behavioral thing. It's really the extension of a number of factors. But in a lot of cultures, it's really stigmatized heavily and also very, as we always say too, it's still heavily associated with shame. But we do know that's a result of an underlying mental illness in the majority of cases. In some cases it's not. And sometimes too, suicide just happens seemingly without warning. That's not the norm. So I just want to address it as well too. There are warning signs and clues and situations and behaviors that we can look out for and help address that individual again who's in a crisis. But when we look at suicide, there's also these myths and misconceptions, and I want to talk a little bit more about some of the more common ones and why they're myths, and then address again now the realities of them too. So the first one is, no one can stop a suicide, it's inevitable. Of course we know that's not a myth. We know that in this case too, reality is that if people do get the help and support that they need, in most cases, they will not go on to attempt suicide again. The second myth is that confronting a person about suicide will only make them angry and increase that risk of suicide. Again, the reality is, if you actually confront somebody and talk to them directly, it actually opens up their ability to not only understand that somebody now is empathetic and somebody is there to address the situation, but it gives them the ability to talk about it too as well too. It makes it okay. And that's a really one thing I want to address as well too, because when we talk about suicide, people think, oh, if I talk to someone about the suicidal ideation, now I'm going to put the thought in their head. But that's not the case at all. It actually opens up their ability, and it allows that person to connect with somebody who actually understands, in the case that they understand that they need to be connected to help. They don't understand what they're going through, because nobody can understand what somebody who's considered suicide is going through, but they can connect them to that help. The third myth is only experts can prevent suicide. Well, that's why we're here. So as gatekeepers, really you're at the forefront of why we as community members are needed to address the importance of helping anybody in a crisis. Because really as gatekeepers, really the main thing is that we want to address why is somebody considering suicide, but how we can connect them to hope. And that's really the underlying pervasive message surrounding QPR. So another myth is that suicidal people keep their plans to themselves. This is actually a really big myth. We do know, of course, through nonverbal communication, as well as direct communication, often people do communicate their intent. And in reality, we also know too that in about 70% of cases where people have gone on to complete suicide, the week preceding their attempt, they've actually given some sort of clue or warning sign. But I also want to address that one thing too, because a lot of times people want to blame themselves and say, what could I have done? Or what didn't I see? But we want to address that nobody is to blame. It's just that we want to keep in mind that there are warning signs and clues that we can look out for. The third myth, the fifth myth is those who talk about suicide don't do it. In a lot of cases, people, again, they do go on to attempt or complete the act, but they do talk about it in some way, shape, or form. And this last myth is that once a person decides to complete suicide, there's nothing anyone can do to stop them. Really, I want to talk about this is because as gatekeepers, it's really most often that people will talk to friends and family first before even talking to a professional. So really, we will talk about that suicide is the most preventable form of death, and it's really everyone's business. This is something that we can all address and that we can all talk about. That's why we're here. Does anybody have any questions about these myths or any of the misconceptions? So now I'm going to turn your attention just to some statistics. So these are all taken from the CDC, or Centers for Disease Control. But from about 2010 to 2017, the rates of suicide have been increasing. And we do know that suicide is always a public health crisis. I can't say this enough, it's a public health crisis. And about one person dies every 11 minutes by suicide. But so in 2017, just over 47,000 people in the United States lost their lives to suicide. But if you take that actually in account that in just to Minnesota, it's 783 people that lost their lives to suicide. I don't know the specific amount within cultural populations, particularly obviously the immigrant community or refugee populations as well too. But this, in terms of generalization, 783 people did lose their lives to suicide in Minnesota alone. But when I talk about these numbers too, I also want to say that within Minnesota, the rates of suicide have not only increased exponentially, they also increased fourfold in this case. So we do know that suicide has increased by about 40% from 2010 to 2017 alone in Minnesota. But when we look at suicide, we also have to look at attempts on suicide as well too. For every one person that does lose their life to suicide, there are 25 attempts. So this is what is known as a ripple effect. And when we talk about this ripple effect, we say that not only suicide, of course, affects that one individual who's lost their life to suicide, but it creates an enormous toll on those friends and family, teachers, faith leaders, those most connected to that individual. So it's devastating. And for Minnesota alone, if you times 25 by 783, it's just over 19,000 people that attempted suicide last year alone. So again, it's quite a number of people. This is something that we always need to be talking about, but it's quite pervasive as well too. So now we'll look at some suicide clues and warning signs. But just before I talk a little bit more about this, the two things I also want to emphasize that we as gatekeepers, I always want to talk about hope and connectedness. When an individual feels really connected, not only to their friends, to their family, but also to their community, this is where gatekeeping is really, really most important. Because as a gatekeeper, not only now do we have the knowledge of looking through these warning signs and these behaviors, but through the empathetic compassion that we show towards an individual, we can offer that hope and again that sense of connectedness. Because hope and connectedness are really one of the two key protective factors that help protect against suicide attempts, and as well too, research has shown through completed acts as well too. Individuals have often said, a suicide note hasn't been left, but that hope wasn't there. But if hope is there, often a person does. I decided to kill myself. I wish I were dead. If XYZ doesn't happen, then I'll kill myself. And in a lot of majority of cases, people don't really use direct verbal clues, but in some cases they do. And these are, again, clear channels of communication. But on the other end, people will actually use indirect or coded clues. And just some examples of these are, I'm tired of life, I just can't go on. My family would be better off without me. Who cares if I'm dead anyways? I just want out. I won't be around much longer. Soon you won't have to worry about me. And oftentimes when people are talking about indirect verbal clues, they usually use coded forms of a goodbye. Does anybody have any questions about these direct or indirect verbal clues? These are just some examples. Again, we want to say that these are just signs to look out for, or clear channels of communication to look out for too. But people will express their intent, usually, again, indirectly, through those goodbyes, or they really see no tomorrows. So a lot of times people are feeling hopeless or worthless, or in many cases as well, feeling helpless. So these are some of the behavioral clues that I'll talk about as well too. So these are really the primary factors we'll talk about when we talk about those warning signs to look out for. Again, there's not an exhaustive list, but these are the ones that have been considered most at risk for people. So a previous suicide attempt. This one's at the very top because an individual who does have a history of a previous suicide attempt, they are more likely to attempt suicide again. However, as I said before, in most cases, people will not go on to die by suicide who do go on to attempt suicide. Acquiring a gun or stockpiling pills. So this one is what we call means. So for a lot of people too, stockpiling pills includes over-the-counter medication, but also too, they might Google anything about talking, writing, or drawing about death, or collecting means. And when we talk about means, we really talk about guns. And we'll talk a bit more about how means and suicide both play a role. Co-occurring depression, moodiness, hopelessness, or unexplained anger. And I kind of just want to break this down for, again, individuals who are often contemplating suicide. It's really hopelessness and worthlessness and helplessness that they're feeling. And again, untreated hopelessness, which is, again, a person sees no tomorrow, is associated with depression. And untreated depression, again, is a primary risk factor for suicide. Also unexplained anger, and I want to put that kind of into perspective too, because lots of times when I give this presentation, I'll give it to teachers, and for a lot of students, you'll see that not only they might have a change in their behaviors, all of a sudden they're once a quiet student, they become more impulsive, they become more irritable, or sometimes even more irrational. And you see these extreme shifts in behavior, and so that individual as well too, maybe again going through an underlying mental illness issue as well. Putting personal affairs in order. And for this one, if anybody feels comfortable, can they kind of tell me what they think that this may look like, putting personal affairs in order?
So like reorganizing personal wills, or just making sure that, for example, my life insurance will cover my wife and my daughters, or something like that.
Exactly, right? Just to ensuring that that person, or the family, their community is taken care of after they pass on. Giving away prized possessions. Can anybody else tell me kind of what this may look like?
Like if you have a pet or something, putting it in care of somebody, or any other belongings, giving them away.
Yeah, anything really cherished or really treasured, right? In the case of my friend that I actually spoke to, and she doesn't know that I tell this story, she was actually a scrapbooker, and she gave away her scrapbook collection. And that was really, to me, not a subtle clue. It was really intentional, and that was something that, to me, was a red flag. We actually never talked before about her challenges because she never wanted to address them. So after that, I asked her, "Are you doing okay? What's going on?" And then the suicide conversation did come into play there. So it's really something to that individual that's most prized. Again, for example, like your pet. Sudden disinterest or interest in religion. But the one I really want to focus on is drug or alcohol abuse or relapse after a period of recovery. In the majority of adolescent suicides, particularly too as well in cultural populations, it's really that drug or alcohol abuse is identified as a cause of a suicide attempt, or in this case, a cause of somebody that dies by suicide too. and as well sudden mood lift or unexplained peacefulness. So this one is kind of harder to understand for a lot of people, but for an individual, if they decided that they are going to complete suicide, they'll actually have a shift in mood where they'll feel more at peace. And in reality, what we want to see is a natural progression to that individual's contemplation with suicide, because it means that they haven't addressed that underlying issue. So these are some situational clues that we can all look out for. Again, it's not an exhaustive list. Being fired or being expelled from school. And we do know too that for a lot of students, these academic pressures are quite high. And, it's not just what parents think sometimes is just one bad grade, or, but it's a culmination of things too. Those academic pressures can really force an individual to think about contemplating suicide. A recent unwanted move. And for this one, we do know that depression can form from relocation. And this I often talk about to individuals that have gone through either a relocation from another country, as well too, because now they've lost their family unit. So they can endure not only now a sense of isolation socially, but they're not connected to either their language, not connected to their culture, not connected to their family. So they can get what is known as relocation depression, which can actually lead to suicide. Loss of any major relationship. So this can not only be, a caregiver or a parent, but it can be a teacher. Again, it can be a faith leader, it can be a coach. It can be anybody that person feels the most hope or that sense of connectedness to. Another situational clue is death of a spouse, child, or best friend, especially if by suicide. And these individuals are actually what are known as suicide loss survivors. And in the majority of cases for these individuals too, they're actually at higher risk of suicide attempts just because of their close proximity to that person who has died by suicide. And diagnosis of a serious or terminal illness. And this one we like to think now as well too, for individuals who experience more serious or chronic diseases, and individuals even so far somebody who has diabetes or cancer, but as well as we also like to think about the older population. A lot of times too, for elderly population, they think of themselves as being a burden, of course, which is not the case. But when they're contemplating suicide, not only have they had a sense of oftentimes social isolation, but as well too, there's the loss of health or the loss of their friends. And when we talk about this burden in the elderly population, it's really the most affected are those males over the age of 85. Because males actually have a higher suicide completion rate because they use more lethal means, whereas females have 3 times more attempt rates. Some additional situation clues are sudden unexpected loss of freedom or fear of punishment. Question. So when I talk about unexpected loss of freedom, I also want to kind of parlay this back to individuals who, in the cultural communities we talked about, and they may have had either, like that, again, that sense of family isolation because they're being moved from one country to another, but also too, when we talk about fear of punishment, these are recently incarcerated individuals as well. But anybody who really faces public scrutiny, in a sense, when I talk about this, we look to social media because oftentimes that really is a huge culprit, and a lot of times too, not only for youth, but just anybody. When they're scrutinized in public, or they have that sense of shame, that can also increase that suicidal ideation for anybody who's struggling with a mental illness. Anticipated loss of financial security. Of course, this can be individual. Also, too, we do know that during times of economic recession, historically, suicide rates do go up. As I said before, the loss of that community unit or family unit, friends or family, and the fear of becoming a burden to others. So now we're going to get into the QPR, so the tips for asking the suicide question. And really what I emphasize is it's not less about how you ask, it's that you actually ask that question. And this is where normally, if we had more time, we go through kind of a role-playing scenario, because you can talk about it all you want, but if you don't practice the QPR, it's really not as easy as people may think. And it's really something that you have to practice again and again and again. In order not only to feel comfortable, but in order, again, to help that person get that help that they need. Because it can be really anxiety-ridden. In the case of my brother, I talked about him as well too. Even though, he's my brother, I love him. It was still, for me, it was quite difficult to have that conversation. But we had it. But I didn't practice it. But I really encourage anybody to practice QPR. The first thing is, if in doubt, don't wait. Ask the question. And I want to talk a bit more about that too, because if in doubt, don't wait, ask the person. If the person is reluctant, you say you really want to be persistent. And when I talk about persistence is something that may seem easy, but it's really the idea of persistence is something that is not easy. So in the question of asking those tips or asking that question, we can allow the person to talk freely, because this is a time when somebody is not only at their most vulnerable, they're also at a time when you don't want to be judged, or you want to really show that concern and that empathy for that person as well. So you want to ensure that you have time in allowing them to talk freely, and most importantly, openly. And then as well, give yourself plenty of time and have your resources handy. We have phone numbers, which I'll talk a little bit more about that too. But within the 7 Metro County area, there's these crisis numbers that you can be connected to 24/7. And I actually wanted to talk a little bit more about these the crisis numbers too as well too. There are interpretative services available for them as well. But another number I want to talk about, which was addressed in Nicole's presentation, is a National Suicide Prevention Hotline. That's 1-800-273-TALK. You can text or call that number too. Currently at this time, it's only available in English, in both text and calling. But again, there's a trained counselors 24/7 that you'll be connected to, and it's confidential and it's anonymous too. There is sometimes a direct approach, but some people prefer a less direct approach if they are a little hesitant or maybe don't know how to ask directly. The less direct approach is, have you been unhappy lately? Have you been so unhappy that you've been thinking about ending your life? Another way is, do you ever wish you could go to sleep and never wake up? So just looking at that second question, can anybody tell me why that one could be so important? I guess more to just kind of reframe it, for someone who lives with depression, could they say yes or no to this? What is easier for them to say? Would it be easier for them to say yes or easier for them to say no to this question?
Yes.
Yes, yeah. So most likely they would say yes. And often the case too, that's kind of that red, that warning sign that goes off in our mind. So if we know that they are living with depression, or if they indicated through this question that yes, they wish they could go to sleep and never wake up, then we know that they do need to be connected to professional help. So again, that's a little bit less direct approach to kind of ease that individual in and asking that suicide question. But really what we want to get at is the more direct approach. Again, those clear communication channels. And the one I really want to address is, are you thinking about killing yourself? This is really key. If we can ask that question directly, again, you don't put the thought in that person's head, but if we can ask that question directly, most oftentimes, people who are thinking about killing themselves will say yes. But again, it's not as easy as me just being up here and saying, yeah, are you thinking about killing yourself? It's not as easy as just asking that question. If you can't ask the question yourself, I would say find someone else who can. And there's a couple of things we can do on not to ask the question. And the reason that we talk about this is because this is actually, through again this evidence-based research, these have been questions that have been identified that people have asked. We're not trying to embarrass anybody. These are ways that we can really ensure that we're getting at the heart of the issue, but we're not ensuring that the person is judged or feels vulnerable or is, again, feeling embarrassed that they, again, are considering suicide. But this is a person's life that we're thinking about. So these are ways that people have asked a question, but it's really how not to ask a question. You're not suicidal, are you? Yeah, this has been asked. So why is this problematic?
Well, it makes it hard for them to say yes.
Yes, not only that too, but also too, we're really addressing that we don't want to help them because this gives us an easy way out. So we're kind of ambivalent. We're like, are you suicidal? Are you not suicidal? But I don't really want to address this question. So if you say no, okay, then that's good. I don't have to talk about it again. But we all know in reality, this is a way not to ask a question. Another thing is you wouldn't do anything stupid, would you? Other times people have said, you're just kidding, right? So again, this is really problematic because not only now have we called that person stupid, and of course they're not, but we put that person who's in their most vulnerable state now in a place of judgment. Suicide in anybody's life is not to be judged. Again, this person is going through so many things that we don't know about, we can't even begin to know about, but we can begin to empathize with that person too. So we really want to try to be open-minded when you want to listen to that person and not judge them. So now we're in the second phase of QPR, so we're at the P, persuasion. And again, when I talk about persuasion, I also want to underline with persuasion comes persistence. Because this is something that for most individuals, when you do ask a question, they do need follow-up. And that's that key of being persistent as a gatekeeper, as that community member. You're there to help guide that person to the resources. You don't have to hold their hand, I say, but in this case too, you're there to connect them. So you're there to help persuade them. So we can listen to them and give them our full attention. And when we talk about listening, really what we want to do is ask those open-ended questions and ensuring that when we get them in that conversation, that they're there to talk, but also too that we can also use additional time in order to connect them to those resources too as well too. Do not argue or judge or give advice. And when I talk about giving advice, a lot of times people will say, you know, your family cares about you, or, you know, what about your friends, or what about, you know, tomorrow? But in that person, when we talk about suicide for that person is really that means to their end. So for them, really, suicide is the only way out. But we do know a lot of things too. When we talk about suicide, it's really a person doesn't want to end their life. They really just want to end their pain and their despair. So that's why when we talk about giving advice or telling them there's so much to live for, we don't want to put that person in a place of vulnerability. We want to put that person in a place of hope and redirect them to thinking about life. And again, tell them your story that things are so hard. And when I talk about this too, really we want to address the underlying issue is we want to know that person is able to get help. So when we talk to them, we want to ask them, how can I help you? Or what can we do together? And really want to involve that person in their decision making, because a lot of times too, people when they're in suicidal ideations, they're not really self-aware. The idea of self-awareness has actually gone out the window. So as gatekeepers, we're kind of here to redirect that person to thinking about their awareness of their own life, but also their awareness of how they can actually get the help that they really need to.
On the last slide where it said, don't argue, judge, give advice. I think it's kind of common here in Minnesota to do those things.
Yes,
Like judge or give advice, or do the latter. Will you talk more about like specific statements or things to say instead of like, see the bright side, or, you know, what about, you know, your kids or your mom or whatever?
So when I talk about, say, giving advice, for many people, sometimes giving advice is not saying anything at all. That's one of the key things too. But another time is, you ask the person, how are you feeling? Or what is it that you need? So in this case too, we're not giving advice to them directly. We're actually asking them what is it that they need, and what is it that maybe we could connect them to, and from that we could connect them to the most appropriate resource as well too. That's a good question. Thank you. So as well in the P part, or the persuasion part, we have to as well give that person a warm send-off. But when we do give them that warm send-off, we really only have to listen for as long as we can connect them to that help. So we'll ask them, will you go with me to get help? Or will you let me get help? And in some cases too, some people won't want to get help. And we have to respect that as well. I want to address that too because a lot of times people might be afraid of the consequences, per se, of addressing that suicide question or really saying that they are undergoing suicidal ideation because they might be hospitalized, they might have to be connected to the police, as well too, they might just not know what's going to happen in that next step, right? So we have to respect that sometimes people won't want to get help, but we can also always be persistent and follow up with those individuals as well too. So that's where I say, so what if they say no, and you really don't believe them? So this is a case where we don't back down. So it's not the case of being more aggressive, but the case of being persistent and just asking those open-ended follow-up questions. Both. What is it that you need? Who's that best person that we can connect to? And again, in most cases too, there won't be a mental health professional on hand as there is today. So you can let them know that there are mental health professionals and resources that they can be connected to. So I want to talk a bit more about this handout. In that phase, these resources come really handy, and even if you can put them on your phone, that's really one of the best spots as well too. So when we talk about refer, I also want to talk about what we do if somebody is in a crisis. So when do we call 911? If in doubt, and you don't know a person is suicidal or not, you should call 911. And when I talk about calling 911, one of the things that we really should mention is that you should ask for a mental health, or tell them that the mental health emergency, and ask for a CIT trained officer. So these are crisis intervention trained individuals. They've had a number of hours where they've gone through, and they understand not only, of course, about mental health interventions, but they can address various scenarios and situations as well too. So normally those individuals come to wherever you are, so a person's house, they can go to the school. They're often plainclothes individuals, and they're really there to not only assess the situation, but can help de-escalate the crisis as well too. There's also the county crisis team. So this is another form of mental health treatment, but when I talk about the county crisis team, it's a little bit different from 911. So these individuals as well, it's usually a trained therapist, as well as a licensed psychologist, as well as a member of the community. They'll come out to wherever, again, that individual is, but they'll give them an assessment, anywhere from a couple of days all the way up to 35 days, and they'll assess the person whether or not they need to be hospitalized. And so this can be as well too kind of a form of ongoing treatment or ongoing support if someone is not in a crisis. But really when we talk about refer, we want to include the individual in the decision as possible. Give them that autonomy to understand what is going on. And we really don't want to leave them alone in terms of leaving them alone so far as long as we can connect them to a source of support. So in terms of others, in the refer process, we want to get others involved. And we want to ask the person who else might help. So that's why we really have those resources handy, either on our phone or again, we have them written down somewhere. Because we really want to ensure that the person knows that they're included again in that decision. So really, how can we ensure that we just don't talk about QPR? You know, you can talk about it again as much as you want, but how can we really make sure that it's effective? So for it to be effective, we really have to, again, practice. And I keep saying that practice, practice, practice. Because if we don't know how to ask the question, if we don't understand how to be more persuasive, again, not being judgmental or argumentative, and we don't have the resources handy, we can't, as gatekeepers, really prevent suicide. So for effective QPR, we want to tell a person, I can be here for you, what else can I offer for you, but we want to ensure that we practice asking those questions as well too, and understanding those resources, and looking even for more resources within our own communities as well too. But when I talk about effective QPR, I also want to address the language of suicide as well, because there's that stigma and shame associated with suicide I talked about earlier, that taboo. It's because as well, we also use negative language associated with suicide. So often you hear people say that someone has committed suicide or that it's a sin. But in, of course, reality, suicide is really the person's at their deepest, darkest. And we know too that it's really that they don't want to end their pain or suffering. This is really the only way that they see out. So when we talk about suicide, I want to say that someone has died by suicide or someone has even suicided. So that doesn't mitigate or minimize that that person who has attempted or completed suicide has actually, been sinned against or been sinful. Again, this is just something for that individual that they felt was their only option or their only way out. And when we talk about effective QPR, we really want to treat suicide as any other illness, because mental illness is also attributed to physical illness, just like a cancer or someone who breaks their bone. So if someone is in the hospital, if they're being treated for, again, a broken bone, often we'll follow up with phone cards, visits, we'll bring them food. But if someone has been hospitalized, for a psychiatric evaluation or a suicide attempt, often, really it's that there's silence involved, or there's no conversation that's being, continued. So we want to continue that conversation for that individual and let them know that they're connected to the community, that they are felt loved, and that they're not judged. Because this is the way that we kind of end, we always say, not only the discrimination surrounding suicide, but that silence and that shame piece as well too. Because they have to treat this as any other illness. Yes?
Nowadays with PHI, that kind of information sometimes people tell me they can't really share that. So if they're having suicide, nobody knows about it, that could make it worse. What's the solution for that?
That's actually a good question too. In some cases as well, depending on the severity of the case, you can't always, in terms of the provider, disclose what that individual has gone through. However, if you know that someone is, say, going through a crisis, and you can, it's called a mental health directive, and you can give them, they can give you a time to speak up on their behalf. If they have gone through a suicidal crisis and they're on a hospital, you can get permission to actually talk about it as well too. In the case, I know of the HIPAA laws as well too, for PHI. That's a really good question. But does that answer the question?
Yeah, but the problem is, I think, is when they go through the struggle, the neighbors don't know, the church people don't know, we have no clue what they're doing, and if we knew about it, somehow it probably make it much better. Pastors don't know about it, it's like, church and the PHI and make it even worse.
So in this case too as well, when I talk about, I guess, the cultural stigma and shame of suicide, this is why we kind of have to address and just kind of talk about it more. In those situations, we can't always know what that person is struggling with, but if we can kind of open up the conversation, either at our church, at our school, that might address people that really kind of talk about it more and be more aware of it as well too. It kind of is that kind of catch-22 in terms of people not understanding that person's struggling, but at the same time, how can we talk about it more? We just kind of have to kind of start that conversation. So now I'm just going to go to the bonus module. This is actually, we're looking at a means restriction. So often we talk about why people attempt suicide, but we're going to understand now, we're beginning to understand now how suicide plays a crucial role. So there's a couple of case studies that I just kind of want to talk about too. So in Sri Lanka, just in the early 90s, pesticides were actually the leading cause of suicide. And well, in the mid-1990s, so 1996, restrictions were placed on those highly toxic pesticides, and suicide rates dropped by nearly 50%. So they estimate that about 20,000 lives were saved. However, when I talk about this too, it's really that suicide rates dropped by means of pesticide. So other means, really suicide rates did not drop. So by non-fatal poison means or other means of suicide, there was no drop in suicide. But by means of pesticide, suicide rates did drop in Sri Lanka. And the same can be said for the UK. So just before, prior to 1970, there was carbon monoxide was the leading cause of death by suicide in the United Kingdom. But when they took out carbon monoxide in all gases, so essentially bringing the toxicity to zero, the rates of suicide by that method decreased by nearly about a third. So we're saying then that if we take away the means by which a person can attempt suicide, complete suicide, the rates by those means drastically drop. So that's why talking about means is so important when we talk about suicide prevention. And this one we really want to address in the United States, the most prevalent means is guns. Yeah.
In that place also, did the total, you said the total suicides didn't drop in pesticides?
So for Sri Lanka, the total number of suicides by pesticide dropped, but by non-fatal means, so by other methods of suicide, the rates actually increased slightly. So we just took away. The same with the UK too, yeah. So, for example, I don't want to see the type of means, but when the type of carbon monoxide gas that was used originally, when that toxicity was reduced to zero, suicide by that method, by gas, dropped. But suicides by other means still increased, even a little bit more. Yeah. So it's really, we want to see subtracting that type of means that is the preventative in this equation. Does anybody have any questions about that as well, too? Yeah.
So total went down when actually we reduced the means, right? The total went down.
So the total number of suicides by that means went down. So the total number of suicides by gas went down. But suicide by...
What about overall?
But overall, no, suicide rates actually increased in both cases slightly. Yeah.
So it had an impact, but it didn't have any impact overall.
No, not in either Sri Lanka
So
or...
they just switched the means. Instead of gas, they just choose something else.
They switch to something, exactly. But we want to really emphasize means because a lot of times people don't realize that means do play a part as well in suicide. So the reason means matter is that suicidal crises are often relatively brief. We say that it's really an impulsive act. And a lot of times too, when people are thinking about suicide, the majority of people that are thinking about suicide, it's about 25%. When they talk about the time that they have attempted suicide and time to think about it, only 5 minutes has elapsed. So when we want to talk about why means matter, it's really that we want to try to decrease that person's impulsivity to acquiring those means. And I want to offer to you as well that some suicide methods are far more deadly than others. So this is why that the means can be really a matter between life and death. So again, taking away those means is really crucial. In this case, guns. So it's not that gun owners and their families are more suicidal. They're just more likely to die by suicide because guns are more lethal. So they're 3 times more likely to die by gun. But one of the key things that we can do is actually reduce access to means, and it's actually a lot more simpler than people actually think. We have at NAMI is a black lockbox, or there's also there's police stations, there's gun shops that actually lock away the gun. But these lockboxes that we have, they're coded. They're not by keys because we do often know that people, they don't really keep keys on them, or if they do keep keys on them, they don't keep them around their neck. But often people don't know the codes to other people's lockboxes or even, say, for example, bank accounts. So when we talk about reducing means, really the reason that we talk about this is we want to reduce means by reducing access to means. So there are simple steps that we can take. And some of these simple steps include, again, as I said before, going to the police stations. You can lock away the gun. Some people, though, they don't really want the gun to be taken away. So when we talk to those individuals as well, too, we can help them find solutions to maybe dismantling their gun. So we can put the gun in either one part of, say, the trunk of the car, like we can dismantle the barrel of the gun and put another part of the gun in that lockbox. Or, again, we can lock up the guns where an individual may not be able to find them. Because we talk about when we reduce means, suicide is a really impulsive act. So we want to take away, again, those lethal means. And just one more thing I want to talk about too is when we talk about just QPR in general, there are many gatekeepers in the community, but one of them that we really didn't address is that, suicide affects anybody. And it actually, Abraham Lincoln, who's one of the most decorated presidents, he actually lived with severe major depression throughout his life, but he also had his own gatekeeper. And so really when I talk about QPR, it's really that gatekeepers are anybody in the community, and gatekeepers are really those important people that can connect people to the help that they need, even people like Abraham Lincoln. And ultimately, I just want to address that suicide is a subject that is just so nuanced, and there's of course been so much research. But if we just ask these questions and really employ empathy, and we're genuine, and we're talking to people just about how they're feeling, asking them, are you okay, and really asking genuinely, because often when we ask people, are you okay, what's their response? Yeah, they'll say fine. But if we ask that person 2 times, 3 times, and we sit down with just anybody, not in those of a crisis, but maybe they're just they can have either a good day or a bad day. We're employing QPR. So we can get to that next step. We can connect them to help. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
So you said in one of the previous slides that you are not supposed to judge them, offer them help, or anything like that. So when you ask them if they want to go get help and then they say no, what do you do? Because you can't tell them.
No, you can't.
Oh, you do?
No. So in this case too, you can kind of redirect the conversation and ask them in another way. Is there something else that we can do if they don't want to get help directly? Unless they're in a crisis. If they're in a crisis, you call 911, especially if they're immediate danger to themselves or anybody else around them. But if they don't want to get help immediately then, and again, because some people don't, you can redirect them to another source. So maybe redirect them to a number, redirect them to someone else that you think can help them as well too. Because oftentimes if maybe somebody doesn't want to get help directly, maybe they think you might not be the right individual that they want to talk to, but you can connect them to the right individual.
Okay, but how do you do that without giving them advice?
You can say, is there anybody else that you would like to talk to? Because you're not giving them advice directly, but you're asking them, you're just kind of querying them, is there anybody else that we can talk to together, or maybe somebody else that you'd like to talk to alone? And that's not directly giving advice.
And then how would you know when to call 911 or not?
Really, if that person really exhibits any of those behavioral clues immediately, or if they're a danger to themselves or anybody else, honestly. But if you think that, in this case too, that person may not be immediate danger, you can actually perform a welfare check. And so there's actually, in the Twin Cities, St. Paul, Minneapolis, there's a non-emergency 911 number that you can call. And actually any, again, plainclothes officer can check in on that person too. If you think that they're, not in the stages of a crisis, they do need to be checked upon.
Like you would call and say, I'm really worried about my friend or my family member, they're not answering the phone. Could you go by and just do a welfare check so they'll go to the house and check on them? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Does that, make it so that they're mad at you now? That you...
Not necessarily, no. Because because I know in that case too, often you think that somebody would be mad or upset, but in most cases, even through research, but individuals I've talked to as well too, really when a person has shown that somebody else cares about them, it's really now that they feel that they can get the help that they need.
I think too, like as a therapist, I would rather somebody be mad at me than me just be worried that they're going to be mad and not then something else happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess being mad at that was kind of a selfish way to put it, but it would burn the relationship, so you wouldn't be able to you wouldn't be able.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like
Right.
they would never open up to you after that.
Right.
Probably.
Right. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, so I know because in some situations that does happen, but rather you save a life than have, I guess, Nicole was saying, than not, saving a life and that relationship and person may be burned. But again, that person's getting the help that they need. So, I know it's a hard kind of subject to wrap your mind around because you're thinking, I really want to help this person. I don't want a relationship to suffer, but in that instance, that relationship, it might have to.
I think if you're that worried and that scared that someone is going to hurt themselves, it makes sense to call versus them being mad or not talking to you. We have it's a couple minutes before the hour, so.
Okay, I have one question over here and then another question over here. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, my brother and my mom, we kind of dealt with bipolar and suicidality. My brother's been hospitalized several times, so my mom and my sister's part of my sister kind of works for the board for the mental health group, so she knows about the mobile support. But I just wanted to mention that we attended your guys' NAMI's Safe Talk on Thursday, and they kind of delved a little bit into it because they show videos about what to say and not to say. So I thought it was 3 hours. I thought it was really good. I think it was really helpful.
Oh, good.
So I just wondered, I don't know if you also
thank
teach
you.
that as well, or
No, I don't teach Safe Talk.
Okay.
But that's actually a 3-hour interactive workshop. And again, if you want to do more role playing, I know because this is more foundational.
Yeah.
That does give you kind of more idea on what things you can say for more positive messages as well, in addition to the things that we talked about earlier on today. So thank you. I appreciate it.
And we've done that before with Camp Center the last couple of years with the project and the Safe Talk, but it's something, either one, if there's interest, we can try to schedule it and do it again with the community, or you can go to NAMI and they have scheduled Safe Talks.
They do. We have a few Safe Talks actually scheduled in August as well as September as well. If you go to our website and under education, you can find suicide prevention and you can find Safe Talk.
Yeah, so just kind of piggybacking off all of this, I was just curious if Minnesota is a mandatory reporting state.
It is,
Okay.
yes. There is mandated reporting, especially for anybody that works with youth, of course, but anybody that has indicated that they are suicidal. And it falls under the Good Samaritan Act as well too. So if anybody isn't aware of what the Good Samaritan Act to the individual, in this case, if they're suicidal, if they're harmed themselves or to others, but it poses negatively on you, you won't, of course, be liable for anything against yourself. So, two questions here.
No. Okay. Is the rate of suicide up in the last 10 years due to more guns in the community in general?
That I don't know. I can find that out for you. But in this case, there's a number of factors that they are associated with their rates of suicide going up, particularly in Minnesota. But again, it's cross-culturally. Depends on race, it depends on gender, it depends on age as well too. But I can talk to you later about some of those statistics.
What can churches do in terms of to prevent from suicide?
So can you say
What can churches do
well,
for suicide?
sorry, pardon me? I was going to say, I was going to say that beyond scheduling and training too, there's really when I talk about, because I've given this presentation a couple times in churches, when I talk to the pastor, if the pastor has received suicide prevention trainings, often too, one of the pastors talked to, he said he he uses his sermons as well in order to kind of talk to the congregation more just about suicide and just kind of stigma surrounding it as well too. So kind of having either say really that pastor or even members of the congregation talking to them about gatekeeper training is really key. Suicide prevention.
I think Elder Pang actually questioned really good point, especially for Korean community. You know, not just the suicide, even we can't get into the suicide talking. You know, we just say, oh, we are going to have a mental health awareness, workshop. Nobody shows up. Nobody shows up. You know, if you show up, oh, does he have mental problem? I'm at the meeting, I'm having a mental problem. I want to learn to help others, but they look at me that way. So it's a stigma. They are not coming. Only thing we did so far for the Korean community is parenting education, mother school, father school, and then we just sneak in this kind of topic, but not openly discuss. So that's still our ongoing stigma and the problem as the leaders, the gatekeepers of the community. But I really want to learn how the other communities are doing to let everybody have some thoughts about this kind of serious problem of the society. Our church has suicidal problem, not problem, the instance, and so it's there. It's there in the society and community and even our church, but it's just that do not want to talk about it.
And often too, if you have kind of more of an open dialogue, at NAMI we try to have what are called community conversations. So we invite members of the community to come and talk about mental wellness. We won't really address that it is about primarily mental illness, but when that dialogue and that conversation about mental wellness, it generally holistically transgress into something about mental illness, about suicide. So people are more really apt to open up in kind of those spaces too, where they feel maybe more connected. Even spaces like church as well too, but spaces where they feel really safe. If it's outside of this church, in this case too as well. So I say another suggestion is having kind of a community conversation or a dialogue, but on mental wellness instead of just say on mental illness. As kind of a start too.
And I have a different question. When you see the advertisement or just the label of the depression medication, there is one side effect. Many of the side effects there, but one of them is suicidal thought. Depression medication has side effect of suicidal the thoughts. Why is it like that? Depression medication is supposed to,
I can actually talk about, if we want to, we can have a conversation too afterwards.
Because I have one of my elderly clients began to take the depression medication. A week later, all of a sudden he is gone. So he was gone. So many people thought that could be the side effect of depression medication, but nobody challenged it, nobody studied it. So it just buried the case. But in that case, how do we prevent? That's my question. Last 4 years since he died.
That one I will definitely conversation. But lastly too, I know I have to wrap this up. There is an evaluation on your table, front and back. If you could fill it out, put it at the front, that would be really appreciated. But I thank you for your time. I know we didn't have
Caroline, one more question.
Of course.
Right now, my wife asked you, so I ask for all of you. Korean community, there are suicidal problem. They lie to me or lie to pastor or make a secret. If you mention that one, they cut your relationship. So even pastor cannot approach until they open up. Sometimes a medical school professor, sometimes it's ordinary people. But it's a shame, Korean culture, they hide, lie, don't open. So this is growing. So my challenge, I'm pastor, how can educate? So my question to you, NAMI has any culturally sensitive clergy person training or role model church to increase awareness level and prevent suicidal benefit for ordinary people?
Yes, actually, so it's not within the community because I work a lot too, of course, the African American community, but in North Minneapolis, there is a church. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name, but they have a mental health ministry. And so actually about twice a week, we'll have a congregation come and just kind of have, again, that open session, that open dialogue, just about anything that individuals are feeling. And they've had that connection to, it's intergenerational, so we'll invite youth, we'll invite elders, but just anybody in the community to have that kind of open conversation. And it has spurred individuals to talk more openly, especially too, because it's prevalent, again, in the African American community that people don't want to talk about suicide, talk about mental illness, they just want to cover it up because it's so shameful. But if they have that safe space to talk about it, more apt, and they're more as well too, they can identify people that they will want to talk to. So I can connect you to that resource as well.
Yes, I did.
Yes.
So thanks again, Caroline, for the presentation. She mentioned if anyone wanted a CEU, there's a form up at the front, so go ahead and take that. And then also please complete the survey, and then you can put them up at the front on the table anyway. She'll collect those. And then we'll take a break for the next like 5, 8, 10 minutes maybe. And then we're gonna, after when you guys come back, so there are some cookies and coffee and stuff for a little snack real quick.